In the annals of television history, there are some pretty obvious entries on the shark jumping wall of shame. Pam's dream on Dallas, Cousin Oliver on the Brady Bunch, Lucy and Ricky moving to Connecticut. If you're not familiar with the term shark jumping, it's a reference to an episode of Happy Days, where Fonzie jumped over a shark on jet skis, and it refers to an event in a television program's run that permanently ruins the show. And Roseanne winning the lottery is usually included on that list. But in my opinion, it shouldn't be. Season 9 of Roseanne has developed a horrible reputation since it originally aired from 1996 through 1997. Actually, that's not quite accurate. Even while Roseanne was still airing, Season 9 already had a horrible reputation. And it's one that I've always wanted to argue against. I'm not saying it's the best season of Roseanne. I'm not even saying that it's good. But it's been presented as worthless, a tragic misstep of one of the best TV comedies in the history of American television. Before I go any further, I just want to recap what happened leading up to Season 9 and in Season 9 itself, in case anyone forgot. When Roseanne started on ABC in 1988, it became an instant success. The 1980s had seen popular dramas like Dallas and Dynasty about wealthy families. Even the most popular sitcom at the time, The Cosby Show, was about an upper-middle-class family. Roseanne was something different. It was a show about the working class. When the show started, Roseanne and her sister Jackie were factory workers at Wellman Plastics. Roseanne's husband Dan was a drywaller. Roseanne and Dan had 3 kids, the bratty, popular blonde Becky, the tomboy Darlene, and the weirdo son DJ. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, in spite of being an instant rating success, the show was known for being a troubled production from day one. Creator Matt Williams left the show after 13 episodes. Roseanne Barr thought that she should have gotten the creator credit, and their visions for the show were drastically different and could not be reconciled. Only one vision of the show could go forward, and Roseanne's vision won out. A roulette of writers came and went over 9 seasons. The network never really got along with Roseanne Barr, but she had a hugely successful show, so they had to let her get her way. In addition, John Goodman, who played Roseanne's husband Dan, and Laurie Metcalf, who played her sister Jackie, had refused to continue doing the show if Roseanne Barr had been fired. And then came a rumor in spring 1996 that John Goodman wanted to leave the show. John Goodman's star had risen dramatically with the box office success of 1994's The Flintstones, and his film career looked promising. Indeed, he released The Big Lebowski the year after Roseanne went off the air. John Goodman eventually agreed to appear in only half the season. So with one of the 3 major stars wanting out, it wasn't surprising to anyone that Season 9 would be the final season of Roseanne. What was surprising was that Season 9 took a completely different path than the 8 seasons that preceded it, which had always been about the working class Connor family. In Season 9, the Connor family wins the lottery. And that is what makes Season 9 something completely unique. It is simultaneously a subversion of the premise of Roseanne, as well as the ultimate fulfillment of the premise of Roseanne. In a series where the constant recurring problem for the Connors throughout the series was, if only we had money, it was absolutely a worthy question to ask, well, okay, what happens if the Connors do have money? And the answer is nothing very good. Sure, they redo their house, update their furniture, and get nicer wardrobes. But over the course of the season, Roseanne and Dan's marriage almost falls apart. And as she says when it happens, this never would have happened if we hadn't won that money. Darlene and David's baby almost dies. Roseanne flies in specialists from around the world, and there is just no amount of money that can make the baby healthy. In a series where for 8 seasons, the lack of money had been a recurring problem, season 9 is almost like an alternate universe where they finally get the money. Except they really don't, because it's revealed in the finale that the entire series we watched was actually the contents of Roseanne Connor's book, and that winning the lottery was just a plot in that book. And then, 21 years later, that ending also was undone with season 10. Therefore, in order to keep this from getting confusing, let me present some disclaimers before I continue with this video. First disclaimer. In this video, I will treat the lottery win as real unless I discuss the finale. Second disclaimer. For various reasons I won't get into in this video, season 10 of Roseanne and the entirety of the Connors are not part of my headcanon. That is to say, I choose to believe that the finale of season 9 is the real ending, and anything that came after that is basically fanfiction, and bad fanfiction at that. Therefore, I will discuss the season 9 finale as if it is the true ending of Roseanne, because to me, it is. With those disclaimers out of the way, I want to take a minute to talk about Roseanne Barr. The entire series is based on her domestic goddess character that she created for her stand-up routine, which is based on her real life as a housewife and mother of 3. Roseanne revolutionized television by showing an honest depiction of blue-collar life. Again, the Connors weren't the perfect family you saw in other shows. In the wealth-obsessed 80s, they had no wealth. They could be sarcastic, and their problems were not always miraculously solved at the end of 30 minutes. They faced struggles that other TV families didn't face. And Roseanne was always pushing the envelope, addressing topics that other shows simply didn't at that time. They may have been a different type of TV family, but the Connor home was filled with love, and Dan and Roseanne always tried to be good parents. Roseanne Barr was thrust from obscurity to instant fame, as the first season of Roseanne placed at number 2 in the Nielsen ratings, and the second season at number 1. And this was a time before streaming, before fracturing of mainstream culture, when being the number 1 show on television meant that pretty much everyone in America was watching. Roseanne Barr didn't look like other Hollywood celebrities. She was an outsider. But with her huge and sudden success, she couldn't be ignored. Seasons 1 through 8 satirized blue-collar life, the life Roseanne Barr had before she struck it big. I believe that in order for us to see the completeness of Roseanne Barr's vision, it was only appropriate for season 9 to satirize the life she'd experienced post-1988, when she found herself in a different world as a sort of nouveau riche, someone begrudgingly accepted by Hollywood because she had success, but someone who was never truly treated by Hollywood as one of the in crowd. Even with the number 1 show in the country, Roseanne Barr was always somewhat on the outside looking in, and season 9 gives her the chance to tell us what she saw. Roseanne is perhaps the finest satire that exists of life in a late 20th century American small town. For that satire to be complete, it was 100% necessary to satirize life outside of the blue-collar niche of the first 8 seasons. So, the Connors had to win the lottery. And to be honest, I can see why people don't like it. It seems like a deus ex machina twist to inject life into a series that had been getting stale. In spite of bringing Lacey Goranson back as Becky, season 8 was arguably the weakest season to date. Roseanne's comedy had been getting increasingly broad with fourth wall breaks, extended dream sequences, entire gimmick episodes. and the requisite mid-90s ABC sitcom Disney World trip. Disney had purchased ABC in 1996 during Roseanne's 8th season, and somehow every family on an ABC sitcom found its way to Disney World in the 1995 through 1996 television season. I can understand why many viewers felt that the lottery win was a desperate and misguided gimmick to give a dying show a shot in the arm. But the truth is, it wasn't. It was known that the 9th season would be the last. Knowing that the season would be in syndication forever, there was no need to rock the boat unless Roseanne Barr really had something different to say. What the lottery win partially represented was Roseanne Barr's chance to give a giant middle finger to the network and to Hollywood. In 2011, Roseanne Barr wrote about how she was initially bamboozled by fame into believing that she was actually respected in the business for what she'd pulled off on her show. For years, Roseanne Barr had no problems getting last-minute reservations at the best restaurants in Hollywood. Suddenly, she was being told that there were no reservations available when she knew there really were. As her show had recently fallen out of the top 10 in the Nielsen ratings, it seemed like she was yesterday's news. Roseanne Barr wrote, quote, "The end of my addiction to fame happened at the exact moment Roseanne dropped out of the top 10 in the 7th of our 9 seasons. The feeling of being used all those years just because I was in the top 10, not for my money or even my gluttony, was sobering indeed. I vowed that I would make a complete change top to bottom and rid myself of the desires that had laid me low." End quote. So just as Roseanne Connor came full circle, realizing that the money she'd wanted for so many years did not buy happiness, Roseanne Barr learned the same lesson herself about fame. So, I've given a lot of my opinions about why narratively season 9 was a necessary part of Roseanne Connor's story arc and Roseanne Barr's satire. But is it actually good TV? Is it enjoyable to watch? Is it funny? Well, for the most part, no. I was surprised as I rewatched the season to make this video that the season is largely a mess, and not necessarily in a so bad it's good kind of way like I had remembered. A lot of it does not work at all and majorly misses the mark. At the top of the season, the lottery win should be giving them plenty of new material to explore. Instead, the show continues to retread a lot of the overly broad fare that made season 8 so difficult to get through at times. If you liked season 8's Gilligan Island parody, and I didn't, there's plenty more of that kind of humor to be had in early season 9. We get parodies of That Girl, I Dream of Jeannie, Xena Warrior Princess, and Jerry Springer. Although parodies isn't really quite the right word. These are almost like proto-Family Guy cutaway gags. This kind of almost postmodern storytelling may have been groundbreaking for a TV show in 1996, but 3 decades later, so many other shows and movies have done the same style better. Even though a lot of these parody sequences fall flat to me, I am still thankful to have them. Roseanne Barr really comes alive as an actress in them. You can tell she is having fun flexing her acting muscles as other characters aside from the domestic goddess. Paradoxically, this season is the one that feels the most dated to me. The earlier seasons may have had 80s and 90s fashions and hair, but there was nonetheless something of a timeless look and feel to them. Perhaps this is because I grew up with the early seasons in syndication reruns and had already seen them several times, whereas I was watching season 9 in real time. But this season just feels so extremely particular to 1996 and 1997 pop culture. One thing that makes it feel that way is the theme song, which now suddenly has lyrics sung by Blues Traveler's John Popper. The mainstream popularity of Blues Traveler was rather brief, so this theme song could have only come from a very narrow period of time. In addition to the new theme song, the riff that starts each Roseanne episode is now played on a harmonica. Honestly, I love the riff, and I love the vocal version of the theme song. Yeah, the lyrics are kind of cheesy, but John Popper's voice is so good, and he totally sells it. Another thing that makes it feel so dated are some of the jokes. I'm thinking particularly of when Stella the maid tells Roseanne to put up her hand, as if to say, talk to the hand. If I recall correctly, talk to the hand was incredibly popular to say around this time for some reason. We didn't use the term meme yet in this era, but season 9 is so full of memes that could only have come from 1996 and 1997. A major problem with the season is the cast, or more accurately, the lack thereof. As we've discussed, John Goodman is not in all the episodes, but also Sarah Gilbert does not have much to do in the season. Sarah Chalk maybe speaks 10 words in the entire season. As funny as years of fourth wall breaks regarding the constantly switching Beckys have been, they've really taken their toll on the character by this point, and she basically has all of the depth of wallpaper. Johnny Galecki seems to have aged 10 years overnight between seasons 8 and 9, which is not to say he looks bad, but it's just weird how different David is in this season from how he was in seasons 8 and prior. Darlene and David married at the end of season 8, and in season 9, it's clear that the vibes are really off on their dynamic, and the show has no idea what to do with them as a married couple. A lot of heavy lifting falls to Roseanne Barr and Laurie Metcalf, and they make up a dyad resembling Lucy and Ethel in this season. They play off each other so well, and they're an underrated comedic duo. Laurie Metcalf is always able to bring out the best in Roseanne Barr as an actress. The breakout star of the season, though, is Glenn Quinn. For so much of the series, Mark's character has been nothing but the bad boy or the idiot. This season, he gets to do so much more, and he truly rises to the occasion. This is also the only season where DJ gets a storyline and a love interest of his own, and I actually like it. We've explored Becky's tragic teenage years and Darlene's depression during her teenage years, and it's rewarding to see DJ finally get his time in the limelight. After 8 seasons of DJ being the butt of the joke for his weirdness, DJ comes into his own, experiences a growth spurt, and transitions to extreme teenage awkwardness. In a season where so much of the familiar is gone, DJ is perhaps the Connor who remains most in character, and it's comforting and grounding amidst so much change. We at least get an explanation for John Goodman's absence. Dan moves his mother to a facility in California. It seems strange that that kind of visit would take months, but we can at least suspend disbelief for that. But the way Darlene, David, and Becky disappear and reappear randomly with no explanation is so jarring. This show has always been an ensemble, and we care deeply about these characters. And they just randomly disappear when it doesn't really make sense for them to. Sarah Gilbert has said that she doesn't really remember the 9th season of Roseanne, and it's easy to see why. Aside from giving birth and showing up for the finale, she doesn't really do much of anything in it. That said, the season does have its moments. So, let's take an episode by episode look to see what works and what doesn't. Episode 1, Call Waiting. We left off season 8's finale with Roseanne and Dan having their biggest fight to date after Dan nearly dies from a massive heart attack at Darlene's wedding. After Dan refuses to implement changes to start living a more healthy lifestyle, Roseanne leaves the house to stay at Jackie's. And that's where we pick up in season 9. In the season premiere, there is not much movement. Alone at Jackie's house, Roseanne watches TV and imagines herself and Dan as the character from That Girl, I Dream of Jeannie, and Mary Tyler Moore. It's almost like they didn't get the memo about how lame last season's Gilligan's Island parody was. None of these parodies are really very funny, and it just feels like filler, killing time before we get to Roseanne and Dan being reunited, which comes before the end of this episode. We end the episode with Jackie realizing that they've won the lottery, and I can remember being very excited as I watched this for the first time to see what happened next. Episode 2, Millions from Heaven. The first scene of this episode is a great bit of comedy from Laurie Metcalf as she runs into Roseanne's house screaming in the middle of the night, and I am laughing just thinking about it. Roseanne runs out of her bedroom wearing a bra, and Jackie informs her that they've won the lottery for $108 million. I can tell watching this scene that Roseanne was also struggling not to laugh at Laurie Metcalf's hilarious performance. I believe that final seasons should always be bigger and better to make us feel like the journey we've been watching up until now has all led to this moment. This scene really feels like it's paying off the previous 8 seasons of Connor family money woes. The entire family then meets to discuss their windfall. Darlene is uncharacteristically emotional about the lottery win, but it doesn't entirely feel real. She doesn't say much and just kind of mopes on the couch. I had a feeling watching this that Sarah Gilbert was pretty much over the series at this point, as she really puts in the bare minimum effort. Then I had to wonder, was she just phoning in her performance, or was she getting so little material that she didn't have much to work with? The stars of this episode are definitely Roseanne and John Goodman. They're so realistically jovial as they go to the lottery office to claim their winnings. Roseanne says, "They're much nicer here than the unemployment office." So that kind of reminds me of previous episodes where the Connors dealt with the government. Like the episode where the Connors, aka the Wagners, go to the IRS. Or when Roseanne, Jackie, and Nancy had an unproductive visit to the Small Business Administration as they tried to start Lunchbox. Or even Roseanne confronting the congressman who came to her door to campaign for her vote. This may be the first time the Connor family has ever had a positive interaction with the government. After the visit to the Illinois State Lottery office, the media visit the Connor house to get an interview with the winning family. Laurie Metcalf again steals this scene with her declaration that I helped pick the numbers. A lot of people are not fans of how kooky and one-note the Jackie character gets in later years, but I think Laurie Metcalf makes it work. The Connors have company as their friends and family come to congratulate them. Notably absent, though, is Crystal, who had been appearing less and less as the seasons went on, and for the first time, she doesn't appear in season 9 at all. I think she was only in one episode in season 8, and she's just not in this season at all. Leon also shows up to see if it's true that the Connors have won the lottery, and his reaction is really funny and cathartic. Anne-Marie is also there. She doesn't get to say much, but her presence is comforting, especially knowing what's coming. This is kind of one of the last connections to the old Roseanne. The problem is, in the show where the comedy has always come from the drama that the Connor family faces on a week-to-week basis, it quickly becomes evident that because of the lottery win, there are no longer any stakes in this series. There is an endless string of quips about the difference between being rich and poor. They can now buy brain dams and drink champagne that's out of state. It's all just a bunch of rapid-fire jokes that don't really mean anything. And the jokes in the previous seasons had always been really grounded in the plot. So it's nice to see these characters that we love so much finally coming into money. But we're only one episode into the lottery win, and it's already clear that the writers have realized that making them rich has now sucked all of the drama out of the show. Strap in now because there's 22 more episodes to wait through, and we're not going to get any more plot anytime soon. Episode 3, What a Day for a Daydream. The lottery win should have rejuvenated the show, but the show starts running in circles with this episode. As the title suggests, this episode is largely a daydream the Connors have as they sit at the dinner table. The producers and writers have given the Connors money, but now that they have money, they have no idea what to do with the show anymore. If you were hoping that the lottery win was going to revive a show that has become too dependent on gimmicks, this episode is going to immediately disabuse you of that notion. The highlight of the episode for me was the wraparound scenes of the Connors sitting down to eat dinner. That's something that we've seen so many times throughout the series, and it's a moment that will not be possible later on the season as things get more far-fetched and ridiculous, and more of the cast is not appearing in every episode. So this might be the last time we actually get the Connors at the dinner table in the whole series, and I wanted to hang on to it. Can I just mention, I'm sorry, what is going on with Johnny Galecki's look in this season? David has always dressed kinda in the drab mid-90s grunge and flannel style, so why has he morphed into earring magic Ken all of a sudden? The Jerry Springer fantasy in this episode illustrates exactly what I mean about this season seeming the most dated to me of any season. And it's one of those ideas that probably sounded hilarious on paper, but it just goes nowhere. It reuses the same joke from the previous episode of Roseanne and Dan talking over each other and delving into minutia as they explain the details of their lottery win. It is a painfully boring fantasy sequence that just drones on and on and on. Jerry Springer gets more and more fed up with the Connors as their story is completely boring and pointless and repetitive, and he might as well be speaking for the audience watching this episode. Jerry brings out the rest of the Connor family, and it's the first occasion in the season where Mark is present, but Becky is inconspicuously absent. That will happen over and over, and they never explain it. Talk to the hand because the face does not understand, Roseanne declares when Springer's audience gets hostile. There's a lot of bleeps and violence, and Roseanne offers Jerry's final word. Unlike the universal comedy of Roseanne's earlier seasons, people who weren't watching the Springer show in the late 90s are not going to get any of these jokes. The show has become nothing but gags, and this is another example of how dated season 9 is, because at this point where I'm speaking, Jerry Springer has been off the air for 7 years, and that's kind of surprising because he was irrelevant for many years before that. Other daydreams besides the interminable Springer segment include Roseanne and Jackie posing for Playboy. And that gives Roseanne and Laurie Metcalf the opportunity to play some other characters. Hugh Hefner also guest stars, which I didn't remember. Roseanne's variety show, Saturday Night Special, had gotten canceled. And with all these fantasy sequences, you really get the sense that she's trying to recreate that. But that was a variety show, and this is a sitcom, so it just doesn't work. But it won't end in this episode. It's going to keep going. So Roseanne also has a sequence where she imagines that she's Miss Universe, and I just thought, what does this even have to do with anything? This episode is very forgettable filler, and I did not like it. Episode 4, Honor Thy Mother. This episode is the swan song for John Goodman, and the show does a very good job of saying goodbye to him. Dan is the focus of this episode, which has rarely been the case throughout 9 seasons. The scene of Dan having a heart-to-heart with DJ, and DJ has now taken over Darlene and Becky's bedroom. It's a pretty fascinating callback to the many, many scenes Roseanne has had talking to Becky and Darlene in that same room. Roseanne having a poker night with David, Chucky, Mark, and Leon is also a great callback to the many scenes Dan had playing poker with his friends over the years. Roseanne and Jackie discussing Feng Shui and the Dalai Lama is so very late 90s as well. Eastern philosophy was all the rage in Hollywood back then. Dan decides to take his mother out to a psychiatric hospital in California. It's good because this is closing a loop from much earlier in the series. Dan's mother had not been seen since season 2, and she was institutionalized in season 6. It is realistic that with money, he'd want to find a better place for her. Although I miss John Goodman in the episodes after this, I also think it's somewhat good that the show has a stretch of episodes where Roseanne does not have Dan by her side, um, and she has to be the sole head of the Connor household. The Roseanne Connor character had married Dan and given birth to Becky when she was 21. So she had never truly been alone as an adult. And I think it's important for her character development for her to have that time. Even though it doesn't go great, I am happy to do it. So episode 5, Someday My Prince Will Come. This episode begins with the Moldavian prince falling in love with Jackie and resolving to go to Lanford to find her. I think it's great that they reference Moldavia, which was infamously featured on the show Dynasty in the 80s. Joan Collins, one of the stars of Dynasty, had previously guest starred on Roseanne in season 5 when she played Roseanne's cousin Ronnie. And she memorably remarked that there wasn't enough tangerine chiffon in the state of Illinois to make Roseanne's bridesmaid dress, which was a great line. Something I've never understood. Why are Roseanne and Jackie still working at the lunchbox at this point when they don't need the money? I like the scene where the family all gets dressed up in Carlos's private jet. We're not used to these characters looking glamorous, and it's going to happen quite a few times in this season. Although Carlos is said to be a Moldavian prince, the show really uses him as a stand-in for the British royal family, and there's a bunch of jokes like about the Queen Mother and that kind of stuff, and these jokes all fall completely flat. The commentary on the British royal family is just strange. Like, we don't expect Roseanne to be making those kind of jokes because Americans have just never really been all that fascinated by the British royal family. I mean, sure, in the 90s, Princess Diana was popular, but that's not who they're even referencing. Bev singing the trolley song was the only laugh out loud moment in this episode for me. It's just, I like it when they make Bev, crazy and outlandish. This is the beginning of a 4-episode East Coast tour, and that's something that I'm happy the series did. Because Roseanne had always celebrated itself as a show about life in the Midwest. But American news, pop culture, and politics are undeniably dominated by the Northeast. Not to mention, there's just something so retro about Roseanne going on tour for a few episodes. It's kind of like the arc where I Love Lucy goes to Hollywood. It's not the kind of thing you see in sitcoms now. Well, I don't know, because I don't watch sitcoms nowadays. But it still feels like something old-fashioned to me. Episode 6, Pampered to a Pulp. This is easily the best episode of the season, and perhaps a top 20 episode of the series overall for me. You have Roseanne and Jackie with a ridiculous supporting cast of guest stars, all of whom are absolutely hilarious in their roles. The spa employee Carol starts the episode on a high note when she welcomes Roseanne and Jackie, and every word out of her mouth is tinged with what I can only describe as a panicked disdain for them. She is laugh out loud funny in a season that, until now, has been sorely lacking in humor. She immediately takes to evaluating and identifying Roseanne and Jackie's problem areas and seems to get increasingly offended and intolerant of Roseanne and Jackie's physical imperfections. The more indignant she gets, the more defensive Roseanne gets, and the more apologetic Jackie gets. And the harder I laugh. There is a Xena parody, and I did like Xena back in the 90s, but I'm not a fan of the parodies really, but even the Xena parody doesn't ruin this one. Yeah, so I have to wonder if this episode got played out of order somehow, because it was referenced in the episode where Dan left, which was 2 episodes ago, that they were going on a spa retreat soon. So it seems like it would have made more sense to have this episode come before the previous episode, but who knows? This episode also gives Roseanne and Laurie Metcalf a lot of opportunities to play physical comedy, and they do it so well. With Roseanne and Laurie Metcalf playing off each other so well and a great guest cast, you don't even realize that the entire supporting cast is absent in this one. There's no Dan, no Darlene, no Becky, no DJ, no Mark, no David, no Bev, no Leon, no Scott. It's just Roseanne and Jackie in this episode. But for this one, that's all we need. If you can only watch one episode of the season, watch this one. Episode 7, Satan Darling. Unfortunately, this one just doesn't work. I'm not an Absolutely Fabulous fan. I've seen it, but the dry British humor seems to go over my head. So either I don't get the humor of Absolutely Fabulous or it's just not actually funny. And this episode, I think, is really niche, and you would probably have to be an Absolutely Fabulous fan to enjoy it, which I'm not, so I don't. And it's just, that's something that keeps coming up over and over in this season, is there's like really niche humor, and it's just like, you wonder why they're going there when, that niche is not what you'd expect the average Roseanne fan to get, the kind of humor that those of us who love the show would actually, want to see on our screens. So, yeah, so of course, Absolutely Fabulous is an iconic series, and there is really nothing more 90s than the idea of an Absolutely Fabulous and Roseanne crossover. So in this episode, Nancy shows up, and she's not in this season as much as I had remembered her being, but she shows up, and she's implied to know things about New York City culture, which why exactly would a restaurant owner from Lanford, Illinois know anything about upper class New York City culture? Okay, whatever. Jackie's blonde wig and Roseanne's costume in this episode are pretty funny. The teleplay is actually by Roseanne and Jennifer Saunders, who I think is the creator and one of the actresses from Absolutely Fabulous. And the humor is just too British, okay? I'm sure Jennifer Saunders is funny to British people, and I'm not trying to insult British people, but I don't get it. Another thing is there's like a Tina Brown parody in this episode, and like, again, were average Americans who watch the show Roseanne really going to understand jokes about Tina Brown? I mean, personally, I do, because I read the Diana Chronicles, which is an amazing book. But I don't think average people would. And, I'd probably watched this episode a few dozen times before I read that book, and those jokes went over my head until maybe a couple of years ago. So anyway, another thing is the audience keeps hooting and hollering for all these actors that show up, and I don't know who the actors are. So either they're famous people from things I haven't seen, or there's a bunch of references that are going over my head. A bunch of the characters are named after dog breeds. Why? I don't know. The perfect weight for New York is said to be 2 pounds above organ failure, which, I mean, that's kind of a funny joke, and it's probably true because this was the heroin chic era of the 90s. But look, Roseanne knows her audience. She knows what kind of people are watching this show, and those people, once again, don't live in the heroin chic world. So why those jokes? It's not what we, would get. Anyway, it's easy to see why the common refrain about Roseanne at this time was that the show had gone crazy and it was too off the wall and realistic, because, everything that's wrong with this season is in this episode. Patsy and Jackie both thinking that each other were drag queens was kind of funny. Another thing that the only other thing that made me laugh in this episode was when Roseanne exclaimed, "I'm not going to listen to one more bad thing about Kathy Lee Gifford," after someone tells her that Kathy Lee made little children work in sweatshops in the heat. But again, Kathy Lee jokes, that's so dated. That's another reason why this season is the most dated season. I don't think anybody has thought about Kathy Lee since maybe 1999. There's also a really stupid That Girl parody in this episode, and a really dumb Rosemary's Baby parody in this episode. This one was just not for me. Maybe if you're in the niche that this episode was for, you would get it more, but I didn't get it. Okay. Episode 8, Hoi Polloi meets Hoity Toity. This episode I like. The guest cast is very strong in this episode. Season 9 kind of lives or dies on how good the guest cast is in any particular episode. So Astrid, who's a socialite that Roseanne met in the previous episode, actually brings the Connor family home with her to her upper crust WASP family on Martha's Vineyard. The contrast between the, stodgy, old money New England Wentworth family and the Connors, who show up like they're going to a weekend beach trip in Atlantic City, is really, really funny. There's so many jokes that I love in this episode. Chip Wentworth, who I guess is Astrid's brother, he has a shocked reaction where he says, "Oh my God, the help." And it's really funny. Astrid also at the beginning of the episode, she says, "Where's my portion? I like to have my portion when I get home." And that's such a random line, but it's so funny how they add all these little bits of backstory to the guest characters in this episode. And I just love it. It shows that a lot of effort went into this one, which isn't always the case in season 9. And there's also this really dark subplot that I love that's sprinkled throughout this episode that suggests that perhaps Astrid killed her father. All old money families seem to have some kind of family secret like that, and the Wentworths are no exception. The end of this episode, where Roseanne offers up some working class advice to the Wentworths, is kind of stereotypical. I mean, wasn't that basically the entire premise of the show, The Nanny? But this episode gives us something different than what we had the first 8 seasons. And it doesn't devolve into a stupid fantasy sequence. So, in season 9, that's kind of a highlight. This is one of the best episodes in the season, in my opinion. Maybe the second best episode for me after the spa episode. Okay, episode 9, Roseambo. And then there's this episode. Yeah. This is perhaps the second worst episode of the entire series. Out of all 9 seasons, this is maybe my second least favorite episode. The actual worst episode is not in season 9, so I'll have to discuss that one another day. This is a very surreal episode in which Roseanne, well, it's like the title, Roseanne turns into Rambo to rescue her family as they fall victim to train hijackers. So we are completely off the reservation at this point. Roseanne is not satirizing either blue-collar life or wealthy life here. It's just a total fantasy episode. I don't really know what she was trying to say here. But I think she was enjoying subverting the expectations of the network and the audience. People want and expect repetition from the media that they consume. They don't want to see something experimental or different than what they expect. But the problem is, you can experiment and be different, and you should get credit for that, but the experiment has to be good, and this just is not. So Roseanne had the creative freedom at the time to give them something completely different and unusual, and I think she knew that she may have been nearing the end of her cultural relevancy, right? So this was probably one of her last chances that she would ever have the opportunity to have that creative freedom. So she hammed it up with a completely off-the-wall episode. And this is probably also one of the episodes with the strongest focus on Roseanne's self-identified feminism. Which I won't go further into that, but it's also an interesting take on feminism that I don't think you would get from 21st century media. So the trouble is, amidst the experimental format of this episode, she really forgets to make this episode funny or insightful. If this episode has a perspective, I don't know what it is. In a season that often feels like a middle finger to the network, this episode feels not only like a middle finger to the network, but it's also kind of feels like a public temper tantrum by Roseanne. Again, I do want to say that I have the utmost respect for Roseanne as an artist. I think she's a terrific writer and actor. But I think even she would admit that, in this era, she didn't always have the greatest handle on everything, I think. I think that she didn't have her perspective completely formed. She was in the spotlight and she really needed to take some time out of the spotlight to really sit with the things that she'd seen in the previous decade and um, really understand and process it. And I don't think she'd done that work yet at this point. And um, this is what you end up with. So I hope I don't sound overly critical of her because I really do respect her. But this was not one of her finer efforts. Okay. Episode 10. Home is where the Afghan is. I'm a huge fan of Thanksgiving. It's always been my favorite holiday. And the Roseanne Thanksgiving episodes just feel like home to me. Uh, this one is probably my least favorite Thanksgiving episode, but I still enjoy it. At the beginning of the episode, the shock reveal of the redesigned Connor house is a really great gag, and honestly, I love the way that they made the sets look. Although it's another thing that makes this season so incredibly dated. There's a great scene in the beginning where the Connors rave about their new coffee maker, their new toaster, dishwasher, refrigerator, and their big screen TV. So this is better. This is the stuff that the audience like me and my family that watched the show, this was stuff that we could relate to because this is what, real people would do if we had the money, right? We wouldn't take trips to New York to meet the absolutely fabulous ladies. We'd get, new stuff for our house. I kind of groan when Prince Carlos shows up. His presence takes away from the nostalgia of the first act of the episode. It's like when this episode begins, it's kind of on fire, and then he shows up and it kind of sucks all the life out of it. And the way he turns into a drunk cowboy is just, that joke falls flat with me. I just didn't find it funny. The big reveal of this episode is when Bev accidentally comes out of the closet during dinner. So I remember when this happened, the show got a lot of criticism for it. At the time, it was uncommon for a show, and this is something that, if you weren't alive back then and watching TV back then, you can't understand, but it was uncommon for a show to even have one gay character. So Roseanne already had 3, right? They had Nancy, Scott, and Leon. I remember when the Jump the Shark website still existed, and remember I referenced Jump the Shark at the beginning of this video. So when the Jump the Shark website still existed, what they would do is give reasons why the show jumped the shark, and there would be a number tally of how many people thought it jumped the shark for that reason, like a new character showing up, or when a favorite character left the show. For Charlie's Angels, I think Farrah Fawcett leaving was the number one reason people thought that jumped the shark. Or for the Brady Bunch, when Cousin Oliver showed up, people thought that was the reason. If I remember correctly, Everyone's Gay was listed as the top reason for Roseanne jumping the shark. Well, let me correct that. The Lottery was number 1, but I think that was number 2. But personally, I think that the storyline with Bev works. Estelle Parsons is really great as Bev. Nobody else could have made Bev quite as shrill or annoying or insane as Estelle Parsons did. She's such a great foil for Roseanne throughout the series. And I think making Bev gay gives her an actual storyline because she has to go through a journey of self-discovery through the season, right? So instead of just being, Roseanne's mom, it kind of gives Bev a storyline of her own. And Estelle Parsons is very funny during Bev's speech where she accidentally comes out. And the family's reaction, I really love how they let each person react to the news, and everyone's reaction was completely perfect. So in this episode, instead of Roseanne preparing the Thanksgiving dinner, they actually hire caterers. So Roseanne is used to having to work so hard to make Thanksgiving dinner happen. That's how every other Thanksgiving episode was. So you'd think, she doesn't have to make Thanksgiving this year. She's going to be super happy. But surprisingly, she finds it completely deflating. So what they do is decide to do a good deed at the end by opening up the lunchbox and serving the homeless there. So this episode works well for me. Like I said, it's probably the weakest Thanksgiving episode, but it's still pretty good. And it really feels like here the show starts to center itself. I mean, maybe they realized they lost their way a little bit with Rosambo, and they're starting to course correct here. And I do think that the first third of the season is probably the weakest part of the season, and this middle third is probably the best part of the season. And this is really where um, it starts to feel like more like Roseanne again. So episode 11, Mothers and Other Strangers. So Roseanne is nothing if not self-aware. She has this proclamation at the beginning of this episode, and she's about how so much had changed in their lives and so much had changed in the house. And she's like, it's almost like some crazy lady made it all up. Jackie having phone sex is really funny. Laurie Metcalf is so good at acting out phone conversations. It kind of reminds me of in the Brady Bunch movie where, they have Mike Brady saying, "You did, you are." She's good at talking to nobody on the phone. And what I also find interesting is it's implied, but not explicitly stated, that the conversation that she's having with the prince is the same telephone conversation that Prince Charles had with Camilla that was leaked to the public. So if you're American, you probably don't know about this because I didn't know about this. I read it in the Diana Chronicles. But yeah, well, I won't say what it was because I want to keep this video kind of family friendly. But Prince Charles had a very explicit conversation with Camilla that went public, and it's kind of implied that Jackie is having that exact same conversation with her Moldavian prince. So I don't know where Roseanne's obsession with the British royal family came from, but this joke probably went over most people's heads, including mine. I think this time that I watched it to make this video was the first time I even caught that. I love the conversation between Jackie and Roseanne, where Roseanne says that she's changed while Dan is gone, because I can totally relate to that feeling. When you go home after being away for so long, it really is different. And it's nerve-wracking both for you and for your family and friends. DJ objecting to David's reproduction of the dogs playing poker painting because the bulldog has to win. That was really funny. Roseanne tries to prepare for Dan coming home, and her frustrated realization that she closed up the fireplace is the beginning of a really great running joke that's, I think, going to come back in future episodes. I don't love the B plot of this episode about Bev visiting Nana Mary, mainly because by this point in the series, they've majorly Flanderized the character of Nana Mary. For those of you who don't know, Flanderization is kind of an internet term, and that's named after Ned Flanders on The Simpsons. And what that means is it's when a character who is somewhat quirky is transformed into a complete caricature. So, when they have all these jokes about, Nana Mary, hooked up with the prince's father, Nana Mary met Pablo Picasso. It's all just, it just feels like nonsense, Yeah, I could accept it in the early seasons where they kind of had Nana Mary as the proto Roseanne, because you would kind of wonder, well, how did someone like Bev raise someone like Roseanne? And Nana Mary was kind of like the hippie before the hippies, and that I could buy because there were people like that, right? There were proto hippies before that movement went mainstream in the 60s. But what they've turned her into by this point in the series is just not especially interesting to me. So I don't love the B plot. Okay. But this episode was okay. Episode 12, Home for the Holidays. I love the beginning scene where the family prepares to pick up Dan at the airport, only to realize that they failed to calculate the difference between Pacific and Central Time properly. And when the door opens and when we see Dan, it really is a huge relief. And I can't impress on you if you're kind of like binge watching this now, what it felt like at the time, because the show had majorly missed him. At the time this was originally airing, he had been absent for 2 months. And it really did feel like in that 2 months, the show had become unrecognizable. So him coming back, I think, again, I think this middle stretch of episodes is much better than the first stretch of episodes. And the show became unrecognizable, and Dan coming back is another thing that kind of feels like the show course correcting and centering itself. Roseanne and John Goodman do such an excellent job playing the awkwardness between them. Roseanne knows instinctively that something isn't right with Dan. And they both play that so well. He plays the fact that something's not right, and she plays seeing that there's not something right. And it's so believable. Something that made Dan and Roseanne such a realistic TV marriage to me is that you really do get the sense that they know everything about each other, right? These are two people that have been through everything together, and they can tell when the slightest thing is off with each other, and I love that. I enjoy realistic depictions of marriage on television, and there are few and far to come by, so I enjoy this one. And the scene of Roseanne giving Dan the mortgage to burn is very cathartic and touching, and again, feels like the show getting back to its working class roots. I'm a big fan of the reveal at the end when Jackie and the audience find out that Dan is having an affair. In a final season, like I've said, the stakes should be bigger than anything else we've seen to date, and this sure qualifies. I love Jackie hiding behind the refrigerator repeating, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," to herself. So good. It felt real. Roseanne always had such great outro scenes. And when I say outro scenes, I mean like the scenes that play during the end credits. There's some famous ones. We all love the nearly identical Beckys, for example. And this episode also has a good one with Santa Claus trying to enter the Connor house and then complaining that Roseanne closed up the fireplace without, I guess, filing the appropriate reports about it. And again, that's referencing something from the previous episode. Unfortunately, I didn't see this scene in the Peacock version. Making this video is making me realize that I need the DVDs because I haven't really mentioned it, but I have noticed here and there that Peacock has teared this show to shreds. There are so many skipped scenes in the Peacock version, and they somehow manage to always find the funniest scenes to take out. Not to mention they also remastered the show with artificial intelligence, and it looks like, again, I'm trying to keep this video family friendly. It looks like dog doo-doo. There we go. Episode 13, Say It Ain't So. This episode starts with Jackie confronting Dan about what she overheard in the previous episode. This confrontation is very well done. We've watched the complex relationship between Dan and Jackie for 9 seasons, and you can feel that history between them with every word that they say to each other. Such as when Jackie brings up Dan's father, and Dan had always judged his father, and Jackie makes the point, look, you judged your father for running around on your mother, and now you left you left Roseanne for 2 months for the first time, and you did the exact same thing as your father. And it just utilizes the history of the show so well. I love the scene where Roseanne and Jackie talk, and Roseanne is telling Jackie about how the prince has gotten married to another woman, which Jackie doesn't know about, but Jackie misunderstands and thinks Roseanne is telling her about Dan's affair. So Roseanne keeps saying things like, "I never liked him anyway, and I never thought it would last this long to begin with." And Jackie's like, "What?" And then Roseanne finally shows Jackie like the National Enquirer cover about the prince getting married, and Jackie goes, "Oh my God." And it's very funny. And can I just say, I am so happy to see that the prince storyline is over because he had worn out his welcome quite a while before this episode. Finally, Dan confesses his affair to Roseanne, and she kicks him out. Roseanne is such an underrated actress. She does an excellent job showing how hurt Roseanne is by the fact that the other woman is younger. And I love her declaration that she still maintains her working class values. Because that's something that can get lost. When you come into money, you can really lose who you are. And I think Roseanne, the real Roseanne, maybe herself felt like she lost that for herself for a while. And she had to reclaim that for herself. Um, so this episode is so important in the story arc because Roseanne says to Dan, this never would have happened if we hadn't won that money. And it's her first realization really that money A doesn't solve all problems and B also causes new problems. So I really think like the main arc of the season, this might be like the climax, right? Like it's all kind of been building up to this, and from here until the finale is where we'll kind of get our denouement. All right, episode 14, Hit the Road, Jack. Roseanne is hurt by Dan's affair, so she drives around to different fast food restaurants eating her feelings. Her humongous car phone made me laugh. Of course, at the time, the joke would have been that she even had a car phone because, cell phones were only just starting to become common in the late 90s. And I actually remember my family at this point did not have a cell phone. I don't think we did, no. But we may have gotten one maybe a year or two after this. And there really was like an apparatus that you had in your car that you had to like mount your phone into. Um, gosh. And I don't even think we could plug it into the speakers back then, but I don't remember. Yeah. But anyway, I've gotten off track. Where was I? Yeah, so cell phones were only just starting to become common at that time. DJ meets his girlfriend Heather at the video store. Well, he meets a girl that will become his girlfriend. And this whole scene is very 90s. Like I said, most dated season. The original Star Wars trilogy was just re-released in theaters at this time, and it's kind of nostalgic to remember back to a time where we were all still so excited, and stoked about Star Wars because we weren't all worn out with the Star Wars oversaturation. This episode is actually written by Roseanne, and I love the vulnerability that she puts into the script because Roseanne feels insecure and ashamed by her body, questioning her entire self-worth because of Dan's affair. And I really think that that goes back to the character-based nature of this show's storytelling, whereas a lot of sitcoms are very plot-based. What sets Roseanne apart is that you really love the characters, right? So like we can understand why Dan would have, a midlife crisis, why, being in sunny California instead of boring Midwestern Lanford, is going to, make him want to experience life in a way that he hadn't before. He and Roseanne had married so young. That was just what people did back then. And in the 90s, that's, I believe, the time when people were starting to not marry so young. So they're both going to kind of go through that journey. What if we hadn't married so young? And I think that's a journey that both of those characters needed to have. So, again, that's like, I just want to say, because I do sound very critical about this season at a lot of times, and I want to tie this back to my original thesis that's why this season was necessary, because these characters had to have these journeys at some point during the series, and season 9 is the only season that really gives them the chance to have those journeys. Okay, episode 15, The War Room. So Roseanne locks herself in the bedroom with a bunch of junk food, and the family, as well as Leah, Nancy, and Heather, all take turns trying to get her to come back out. It feels like the middle part of the season is a lot more grounded, and we're making up from some of the more ridiculous, fantastical stuff at the beginning of the season. So Roseanne finally comes out of the bedroom at the end of the episode after everybody takes a shot at her, and declares that Mark was surprisingly the one that made her realize that she needed to move on. So Mark was the least likely one to get through to Roseanne, but he does it by telling her that Dan has not left town and that Dan is staying in town for her. Another thing in this episode that they finally address, thank God, is that Roseanne and Jackie agree to give up their shares to the lunchbox to Leon and Nancy. I wonder if people who hate season 9 just watch the first third of the season and then give up on it. And I guess that's a shame that they didn't put their best foot forward, because this middle arc is really good. Episode 16, Lanford's Elite. Jackie and Roseanne are invited to the Lanford Country Club, where they meet the heretofore unmentioned Edgar Wellman Jr., the heir to Wellman Plastics, where Roseanne and Jackie worked in the first season. We actually get a flashback to the season 1 finale, where Roseanne had led a worker walkout from Wellman Plastics. And I believe this is not the first time in the series that they had flashback to that scene, but I could be wrong about that. But it's just such a famous, scene from the show. And I think it was actually Matt Williams who had insisted on the factory workers being part of the show, because what happened, I believe, is an amalgamation. I believe that, and I might be wrong about this, but this is my understanding based on some of the things I've read, that Carsey Werner, which was the production company, kind of matched Roseanne with Matt Williams, and they both had ideas of a show that they wanted to make. Matt's was about the plastics factory, and Roseanne's was about her domestic goddess routine. And they kind of merged those in with each other, right? And, Matt Williams, as I said, had been fired. Well, not fired, but had agreed to leave the show after 13 episodes. So I think this is kind of Roseanne, when she walked out from Wellman's Plastics. That was kind of her getting rid of the last vestiges of his vision for the show, so that she could enact her vision for the show. Again, that could be wrong, but that's my understanding. Anyway, that was a diatribe on season 1. Let me get back to season 9. A big theme of this entire season has been the difference between working class and upper classes. And that's interesting to me, because whereas class has always been extremely important in British culture, it hasn't been in American culture. It was kind of our lack of interest in that set us apart from them. I really think that Roseanne is culturally significant because the entire series has been an emergence of class consciousness in America, as that flashback to season 1 reminds us. And this episode actually works pretty well. I love the running gag about the missing Crane twins being in the Wellman basement, and the outro scene where Jackie sees them and starts screaming is freaking hilarious. Of course, no surprise, Peacock does not like humor, and that scene is cut out from the Peacock version. Okay, episode 17, Some Enchanted Merger. Okay, so this part of the season, I guess this whole Edgar arc is a little bit of filler for me, in my opinion. I can see why they needed to do it, not just because they didn't have John Goodman for the whole season, but also because, we wanted to see Roseanne by herself. You know what I mean? We wanted to see how she would handle that. Nonetheless, I think everyone knows it's inevitable that Roseanne and Dan are going to end up together. So it is, even though it's not as bad as the beginning of the season, it is not as interesting to me. So anyway, episode 17, Some Enchanted Merger. Roseanne has been seeing a lot of Edgar as they seek to make a deal to turn Wellman Plastics into a worker-owned company. And Jackie thinks that Roseanne has a crush on him. And we get to see a lot of fantasy sequences. So, again, it feels like filler that we're doing these fantasy sequences again after we've gotten away from them for a while. And now we're unfortunately back to them. So like I said, we all know that the show is going to end with Roseanne and Dan together. But I think it's important for the show to explore the option of Roseanne being with another man. And that's also going to come back and be important in the finale. She's going to explain, again, spoilers for this finale. This is all Roseanne's novel. She's going to explain why she put in that bit about her being with another man. So she really needs to choose Dan in the end. And in this episode, she does. She may not realize it yet, but at the end, she chooses Dan. Because she realizes that she can't be with anyone else but Dan. And that's what true love is all about. And, the show has told us over and over that, Roseanne and Dan are one of the greatest couples, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that, we find that a couple is truly a great couple when they're facing that kind of adversity. So Dan, has to choose Roseanne, and he does, because he never goes back to California. And Roseanne has to choose Dan, and she does um, because she ends up not being with Edgar, even though she has the opportunity. Um, so in my mind, I had actually remembered this Edgar storyline lasting longer than just 2 episodes, so it was kind of surprising to me that this episode was the last of it, but I'm not complaining either. Episode 18, A Second Chance. So this episode opens up with Roseanne meditating, and she mentions Kabbalah, which I don't know what Kabbalah is, but that was something that Madonna had released her Ray of Light album around this time, and that was something that was very in vogue in Hollywood and in, I guess, upper class communities. So it's another thing. I don't want to demean what Kabbalah is, because again, I don't even know what it is. But it was, another thing that kind of makes this seem a little dated, because it was all the rage at that time. And I don't think I've heard anybody mention it in the past 25 years. So Jackie says that Dan is coming by, and Roseanne says the F word and gets bleeped, which is another joke that is very late 90s. People getting bleeped. We all thought that was hilarious back then for some reason. And it's not even the first time this show has done it. Not even the first time this season that they've done it, but it also makes the season seem dated to me. And when I keep saying how dated season 9 is, I'm not complaining. It's just kind of ironic to me that this season where they're wealthy is the season that seems the most dated. So finally, Dan apologizes to Roseanne for getting involved with his mother's nurse in California, and Dan and Roseanne get back together in this episode. So in my mind, again, I'd remember Dan and Roseanne being separated for longer, but it was only 4 episodes between their breakup and the reunion. So I think overall the show does a great job managing John Goodman's absence. And this reunion comes just in time for Darlene's medical emergency, and she's going to go into labor in this episode while they try to stop her contractions. Her doctor, Darlene's doctor, is played by Dan Florek, who is famous from, I think, both the original Law and Order and the Special Victims Unit spinoff. And this is actually his second role on Roseanne, because he played the high school principal in the episode where Becky was accused of flipping the bird in the class picture. And I don't even think that he's the only actor that has had 2 roles on Roseanne. Yeah, because one of Frank Zappa's sons, I guess, was Roy in the episode where Mark and Becky are living apart, and Roseanne finds out that Darlene and David have been living together. I think that's season 6. And he is also in this season in the spa episode. So there's been a few actors that have played 2 different roles. Also, the maid in the episode from this season where they had gone to Martha's Vineyard with Astrid's family. She was in that earlier episode, that bad episode in the Jerry Springer parody. So they kind of have their famous actors that they like using over and over, I guess. And this episode ends on a cliffhanger as Darlene's water breaks, and this is the beginning of the final arc of the season. Episode 19, The Miracle. Darlene gives birth prematurely, and her baby is not expected to live. This episode hit me so much differently watching as an adult than it did when I was a kid. So like I said, I don't know if I did say this yet, but I'll say it now. I was 9 years old when this season came out. And I saw all these episodes in real time, but I've also seen them several times in reruns. It's just Roseanne has always been a big part of my life. But watching this episode to make this video hit me very, very differently. As with all Roseanne's, I've seen this one several times. But when I rewatched it for this video, I actually cried for the first time while I was watching it. And this is the climax of the season, where the reason for the lottery win really becomes clear, in my opinion, because Roseanne keeps stating that money is no object. She knows that her granddaughter is probably not going to live, and she keeps saying, well, we can afford whatever, breakthrough therapies there are that would heal her. She's looking to hire world-renowned neonatal doctors to take care of her. And Roseanne is told that, I'm sorry, but your money makes no difference. Your granddaughter, you may be rich, but your granddaughter is probably going to die. There's just nothing that we can do for her. She was, too premature. And there's nothing that any amount of money can do about that. So in a series where so often the family's problems could have been solved with more money, it really goes to show and to teach, not only the Connor family a lesson, but also the audience a lesson who could always relate to the Connor family's financial difficulties. It shows that not all problems can be fixed with money. In the end, Darlene decides that since her daughter is unlikely to survive, she wants to remove her daughter from the machines because the machines have been breathing for her daughter, and Darlene wants her daughter to experience at least a few moments of life not hooked up to machines. And that's just such a heartbreaking decision for her to have to make, but I can understand why she would want that. So Darlene, Becky, and Roseanne and Jackie all take turns holding the baby after, they unhook her from the machines that have been breathing with her. And Darlene names her baby Harris Connor Healy. So Harris, obviously, to represent Roseanne's maiden name is Harris, Connor as her middle name because, that was Darlene's name, and then Healy is David's name. And this is such a heart-wrenching scene. So much of season 9 has been fantastical and experimental, and it's good to see that the show can still pull off this kind of drama when it needs to, because, drama is something that this show has always excelled at better than other comedies. There's a famous trope in the 90s called the very special episode where, a very special episode, like, for example, on Full House, Stephanie befriends a boy whose father has been hitting him. It's a very special episode because it's dealing with a very serious issue. When Roseanne tackled those issues, I don't think it ever felt like a very special episode. For example, like the two-parter where Jackie is being hit by Fisher. It's a very great episode, and it never felt like they were forcing the drama, or it never felt like melodrama. It always felt very organic. And this episode, I think, this episode does that as well. So in the end, Harris survives, and Roseanne and Dan's marriage is back together, and all of the major plots of this season have been tied up. And the remaining 3 episodes, I think, are just supposed to be solid, fun episodes before the finale. And out of those 3 episodes that we have left before the finale, I love 2 of those 3, and I absolutely despise one of them. So let's keep going. Episode 20, Roseannefeld. This episode is fun. It's filler. Like I said, the 3 episodes before the finale are not covering much plot. They're all just kind of filler. But this is entertaining filler. I don't understand the title. I don't understand why they would call it Roseannefeld, because nothing in this episode really reminds me of Seinfeld. And there are 3 storylines in this episode. So the first storyline is Mark and Jackie attend a pro wrestling event together. The second is DJ is home alone with Heather, and thinking about progressing their romance further. And the third is that Leon and Scott meet Joyce, who is Bev's new love interest. So the funniest scene in this episode is when DJ calls Mark on a payphone to ask where he might find a condom. And after Mark hangs up with DJ, he tells them, I think, they're like in Papa Bear's nest or something. After Mark hangs up with DJ, telling him that basically they're in Dan's top drawer, Jackie asks if everything's okay with DJ, and Mark says, "Oh yeah, he just needed a condom." It's just funny. I'm not really a fan of the Joyce, Bev, Leon, and Scott scenes. Those scenes just really fall flat for me and come across as very dated and in a bad way. Because with all the talk about show tunes, the basic joke of the plot is that 2 gay couples are on screen. And I'm sure that was very transgressive in 1997, but it just doesn't have the same effect in 2025. Like, we need actual jokes. Just the fact that there's 2 gay couples on the screen is just not very funny in 2025. But I'm sure it was groundbreaking in 1997. So episode 21, The Truth Be Told. I would have made this the penultimate episode instead of Arsenic and Old Mom, but I'll talk about my disdain for that episode when we get there. It just seems like the series would not be complete without Roseanne's take on show business, and that's what we get in this episode. So Roseanne had to fight the network executives for 9 years to execute her vision for the series. And she's very brutal to network executives in this episode. So the basic plot is that network TV, which is to say, back in the 90s, we had network TV and cable TV. So network TV being ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC. Network TV and cable TV are competing for the rights to make a made-for-TV movie about Roseanne's story. And the difference between network TV and cable TV, maybe if I have younger listeners or international listeners, the difference is that network TV, because these were over-the-air networks, like using the public broadband, basically. They had to abide by certain rules and regulations about what they could show. Like there's certain words that they could not say. There's certain content that they could not show. Whereas cable TV, you can show anything. So, for example, a show like South Park, which came out a few months after Roseanne ended, that was on cable because the things that they say and do on that show, you could not legally do on network TV. So they're competing for the rights to Roseanne's story, and the network execs that she meets are complete sharks. So the network wants to whitewash Roseanne's story, while the cable network wants to sleaze up Roseanne's story. Nobody wants to tell her story the way it actually happened. They want to put their own spins on her story. I love the running joke of DJ trying to sell his film project to the network heads. And the network heads keep asking, well, what's wrong with him? Once he leaves the room, and Roseanne says, nothing. It was very funny. Both of the network heads were very, very funny. Like I've said, season 9 turns on whether or not the guest stars are good, and the guest stars are good in this one. The one who plays the network TV executive went on to play Funkhauser in Curb Your Enthusiasm, and he's great on that show, and he's great here. The B plot in this episode is also really fun. So as a tabloid writer talks with Leon, Scott, Bev, and Bev's love interest Joyce, they unwittingly give him tons of dirt on Roseanne. I love the end of the episode when they show all of the tabloid headlines. And here are the tabloid headlines. Lottery mom runs teenage love nest. Lottery housewife hankers for hemp. Lottery mom's bizarre mayonnaise. Grand theft lotto. Rich kid steals car. Lotto winner to mom. You're old, gay, and in the way. And the best thing is that all these tabloid headlines actually refer back to plots from episodes that we've seen over the past 9 seasons. Episode 22, Arsenic and Old Mom. I'm actually very surprised to read online that people like this episode and consider it a high point of the season, because I've always hated this episode. I can actually remember watching this when it first aired. So it had been 2 months since a new Roseanne episode had aired. 2 months between this one and the previous episode. And this was the final episode before the finale. And I noticed immediately, and again, I was a 9-year-old, that it was not the original actress to play Dan's mom. And the original actress that plays Dan's mom had only appeared in one episode prior to this, back in season 2. And not only that, but they've retconned. And a retcon means, in case you're not familiar with the term, retroactive continuity. It's when a show basically changes what's happened in the past. So they're saying, this is what happened, but it conflicts with what we've already seen. We've seen that something different happened. So they've retconned Dan's mom to have been in the mental hospital for 20 years, which is not true. And the inconsistency vexed me quite a bit. Again, I was 9 years old, and at that age, I was not very forgiving of the creative freedoms that TV shows often take. And to be honest, Debbie Reynolds' performance as Dan's mom just does not work for me. Her daughter, Carrie Fisher, wrote this episode for her, and I understand what Carrie Fisher was going for. This is not an episode where any character acts logically. It's meant to be like a Tom and Jerry episode, right? With Dan's mom trying over and over and failing to kill Dan. And this episode turns on whether or not you find Debbie Reynolds funny in the role of Dan's mom. And I don't. Yeah. What she did with the role, I just did not find amusing. I think she should have hammed it up. If anything, that would have made this episode funny because it's such a ridiculous script that I think she just needed to throw caution to the wind and act it out as ridiculous as it is. And she kind of doesn't. She kind of like shrinks down and keeps it kind of quiet in like weird ways. And I just didn't like her in this role. I can remember watching the end of this episode and thinking, that's it? That was the last regular Roseanne ever? I was a very disappointed 9-year-old. And I've never changed that first impression. The only thing in this episode that made me laugh, both then in 1997 and now, is when Roseanne tells Dan at the end of the episode that his mother is nuts. And Dan's retort is that, Roseanne, people with glass mothers shouldn't throw stones. All right, and that brings us to episodes 23 and 24, Into That Good Night. Now, what about the ending? I can still picture exactly where I was when I watched it. At that point, like I said, I was a 9-year-old who had never known life without Roseanne. Roseanne actually premiered when I was 7 months old. And Roseanne's syndicated reruns were something that we always had on in my house. Yeah, like when our family sat down to dinner, there was usually Roseanne on in the background. And the finale needed to be something big, something to make me feel like my life up until then had all been building to this moment. And for me, it worked. I liked the ending then, and I still like it now. So to recap, Roseanne Connor reveals in a voiceover at the end that the entire series we've watched up until then was a novel that she's been writing about her family. And some of the details that we've seen over the course of the series have not actually been true. So for one, Jackie has actually been gay, just like Roseanne's real-life sister. We also learned that Bev was not really gay, and that David was married to Becky, and Mark was married to Darlene. And then we see Dan Connor smiling at Roseanne. As the camera pans away from him, the music suddenly swells. And then when it pans back, Dan's chair is empty. And Roseanne Connor announces in her voiceover that she lost Dan after the heart attack that we saw that he had at the end of season 8. And when the music swells, I get chills down my spine every time I watch it, even now. To me, this feels right. In all the challenges Roseanne has faced throughout the series, Dan has always been rock solid by her side. So the path that we've been shown after Dan's heart attack is that she had a lot of money, and that after the biggest test of their marriage yet, where, Dan considered leaving her for another woman, Roseanne and Dan live happily ever after, comfortable and rich. But this show has never been about happily ever after. This show has been about an honest portrayal of working class life. So this show made its name in the fact that it didn't always tie things up with a neat ribbon at the end of 30 minutes. So for example, in season 4's episode Darlene Fades to Black, Darlene becomes a sullen and withdrawn teenager. And Darlene is not all better and back to normal at the end of the episode. She's still depressed. She's still barely talking to everybody. It's not in the nature of Roseanne to, do the sitcom trope where everything resets back to normal at the end of the episode. And I think also that kind of shows, in many ways, Roseanne was ahead of its time. And that's another way, because serialization has become a lot more common since then. And Roseanne was kind of the first show to really do that. Roseanne always drew its humor from the trials and tribulations of the Connor family. So anyway, ending the show with the lottery win staying real and Roseanne and Dan living happily ever after just would not feel right, because Roseanne is the domestic goddess, and happily ever after, unfortunately, just doesn't happen very often to the American working class. So the more honest path to take is that Dan didn't survive his heart attack. It is much more appropriate that we would end the show with Roseanne who has struggled to even keep the lights on at times, now having to make it all work without her husband, without Dan to support her through it. So, at the end of the episode, we fade to Roseanne in her basement, where she's been writing the novel that we've spent the last 9 years seeing play out on our screens. And when she finishes her book and triumphantly goes upstairs, the new post-lottery furniture is gone, and we're back looking at 714 Delaware Street the way it looked for the first 8 seasons. The series ends with Roseanne Connor sitting on her couch, and she's down and out, but she's accomplished her dream of writing a novel, and she's hopeful of where the future will take her. She has nothing. She has no husband. She has no money, but she has her family, and for the first time, it feels like she's truly in control of her own destiny. And to me, like I've said, it just feels right. I can't think of any other way I'd have wanted the series to end. Like I said, I loved this ending the first time it aired, and I still love it now. So there you have it. At times, the 9th season has been agony to watch. And I probably will never sit down and watch the whole thing episode by episode by episode again. But I'm hoping that this video will inspire people to look at season 9 with fresh eyes and see it as something other than a gigantic cluster, you know what, as something more than a waste of time, because it is not. I'm happy that season 9 exists. And I think it did have something important to say, something that the series as a whole and something that Roseanne as a whole needed to say. The lottery storyline was a worthwhile endeavor, though it could have been much better executed. And in the end, revealing that the lottery win never really happened was the right choice. I know there's a lot of people that say, oh, it's like saying the whole thing was a dream, you know? But it's not, because I think, for example, the difference between this and Pamela's dream and Dallas, spoilers if you've never watched Dallas, but they have an entire season that turns out to be a dream. The difference between this and that is everything from that dream season of Dallas is just forgotten, and we reset back to the end of the previous season. Whereas this ties in with the message of the series as a whole, right? This was not a mess up. This was not making a mistake and using Roseanne's novel to paper over that mistake. Another thing they do in this episode is they flash back to earlier in the series where Roseanne had received an office in the basement that, you know, Dan and the kids built for her, an office so that she could write a novel. So it just feels to me like coming full circle. Now, do I think that when they made that episode back in season 2 that they had planned, oh, the whole series is going to be Roseanne's novel? Of course not. But it works as an ending for me. And I think Roseanne Connor learns the important lesson that money doesn't buy happiness. And this series would not have been complete without Roseanne Connor learning that lesson. Because she needs to move forward with her life, focusing on her family and on fulfilling her dreams. So I hope you enjoyed the video and that it will encourage you to see season 9 of Roseanne in a more positive light. And if you got through this whole video, please leave a comment of your thoughts on season 9. And if you agree with anything I said, and if you're going to maybe rewatch it and try to see it in a more positive light. All right. Well, thank you all for sticking with me. And I will now go myself into bed. Good night.